He's gone back and forth between softening and not softening.
What they perceive as Trump softening.
They tease a softening
of his immigration stance, and now he's being bashed for not softening enough.
Might see a softening. Scrub that. There was no softening.
The rumors were wrong. There is to be no pivot, no softening, no softening, no softening.
On this semi-soft news day, Donald J. Trump, billionaire, and his team are still rifling through the reviews of his hyped-up immigration speech last night in Arizona. For days, Trump himself and his campaign had been hinting that he was on the precipice of moderating his stance on immigration to make it more congenial to a general election audience. But Trump's speech yesterday was immoderate in both tone and substance. There was no softening. There was no pivoting. There was just vintage Donald Trump. By the time his lengthy stem winder reached its end, Trump was in basically the same place on immigration that he has been all along. It turns out that some of Trump's own Hispanic advisory councils thought that too, and they weren't too happy about it. Here's one of them, Alfonso Aguilar, on CNN today, explaining why he's one of at least 3 Trump Hispanic Council advisors who are now saying adios to the Donald.
He gave the impression, and the campaign gave the impression till yesterday morning, that he was going to deal with the undocumented in a compassionate way. And in that speech, he's basically saying, we deport you or we self-deport you. It's even worse than what he initially proposed. So today I'm saying, not only I'm considering withdrawing my support, I'm telling you today I'm withdrawing my support from Donald Trump. And it's not only me, many like me think the same way.
Undeterred by criticism of that kind, Donald Trump was back on the campaign trail this morning with a rally in Wilmington, Ohio, where he framed his immigration posture, as he always does, as a matter of putting America first.
We're going to build the wall. Mexico's going to pay for the wall. We will treat everyone with dignity, respect, and compassion. But our greatest compassion will be for the American citizen. It will be, from now on, America first.
So Nicole, my friend, Nicole Wallace, the lovely Nicole Wallace, in here to guest host with me again today. After all the toing and froing and Trump's big immigration speech last night, when it comes to that particular area, immigration that is Trump better or worse off politically today than he was before?
I think he's the exact same guy that he has been since he started this madcap adventure. I think he ended up in the exact same place he's always been on immigration, which is to the hard right of his party. And I think that it reflects how he sort of processes choices. I mean, obviously there was a discussion in his campaign about whether he should go to Mexico, whether that might benefit him a little bit to be seen with another country's leader. He said, yeah, I'll do that. But he also chose something else on the menu, to double down in the state of Arizona on the toughest and harshest rhetoric on his immigration policy. So he chose all the above, and I think worse than a muddled message, it was almost a taunt that'll set him back and perhaps the party back even further than they were at the end of the Republican primary.
Yeah, I actually think he's worse off today than he was before in this sense. I mean, having raised all these expectations that he was going to in some way become, as his Hispanic Advisory Council former member, Mr. Aguilar, said, when he was going to move into a more humane place. Having raised those expectations, he then went in the opposite direction. And so I think, the Hispanic vote now is gone to a large extent for Donald Trump, and for a lot of those the people we keep talking about, college-educated, suburban, Republican women, they look at this and say, man, not only is he harsh and inhumane, but he's also inconsistent and has been all over the place, and then he ends up here. It's just not a good look.
No, and unfortunately for the Trump campaign, it underscores this temperament argument that Hillary Clinton is making about him. It's not about what it's about with Trump. The argument they're trying to make is that he can't, it's a leadership argument, that you can't trust someone with the gravest, most consequential decisions of the presidency if they don't know their own mind. And he gave them Exhibit 33 yesterday.
Yeah, that's a low number.
All right, so one thing that is clear about Trump's immigration speech yesterday is that he seems to be giving up on the idea of broadening his base. Instead, Trump appears to be tripling down on the notion that white voters are his only ticket to the Oval Office and all he needs. That path runs right through the heart of the economically anxious folks living in the Rust Belt and the industrial Midwest. That's exactly where Trump was this morning. As we mentioned, he was in Ohio today giving a speech to the American Legion in Cincinnati, followed by that rally in Wilmington. But just 200 miles north, the Clinton campaign dispatched Vice President Joe Biden, who I think is going to be her secret weapon, to the Buckeye State to play a little Donald defense. Listen to this.
We all come from the same neighborhood, the folk in here, whether it's Youngtown, Scranton, Toledo, Pittsburgh. And this other guy, he's not a bad guy. He does not he don't understand this any more than you understand what it's like to live in a 30,000 square foot penthouse, 80 floors up in New York. You don't understand that. I don't. He doesn't have any idea what it's like to sit at my dad's kitchen table and hear my mom said, "Honey, we need new tires on the car." And they say, "Honey, you gotta get 10,000 more miles out." And we just don't have it right now.
Oh, he's good. Trump is putting all his chips on turning out some magical number of white voters. Can Trump win with this strategy, and why would he want to?
Well, I cite the famed Republican chairman, Reince Priebus, who in his autopsy back in 2012 pointed out correctly that Mitt Romney had lost to a large extent because he had done so poorly with non-white voters, and that Republicans, if they were ever going to win the presidency again, needed to do better with non-white voters. Donald Trump, it seems to me, is now doomed to do worse. And as you said, Nicole, he basically, I occasionally go to the roulette table and I put all my chips on red or black. He's put all of his chips on white now, and the only way it could work is if he was the overwhelming favorite of well-educated whites. There aren't enough blue-collar whites for him to win the presidency. There just aren't. And he's getting crushed with white-collar whites by Hillary Clinton.
And I think when you talk about the damage he could do down ticket, this is disastrous for the Republican Party. George W. Bush won 44% of the Hispanic vote. He's basically talking about winning with none, zero. I mean, I don't know. I don't know how you start the rebuilding when you've literally dropped 44%.
Yes.
In your support. Terrible.
It's going to have a long-term effect on the party, I think, for sure. And I just think if you start, there was a time when you could have imagined Trump putting together a different kind of map, maybe being able to compete not just in the industrial Midwest, but maybe even as far as places like Minnesota, Illinois, Wisconsin. But right now, hemorrhaging all of, as I said, those college-educated white voters, there's not a map that works right now for Donald Trump. Unless something changes in a serious way, there's just not enough of the kind of white voters that like Donald Trump to put him in the White House.
I think we agree on that. And again, as a Republican, why would we want our national victories to be made up of just white people? It's the grimmest outlook ever for a Labor Day Eve.
Right, you can't win that way, and why would you want to? All right, over the past 36 hours, we have seen two very, very different Donald Trumps. There was the more measured, semi-statesman-like, some would say sedated Donald Trump in Mexico City yesterday. And then in Phoenix, just a few hours later, Dr. Jekyll replaced with Mr. Hyde. Both times, Trump was scripted, which suggests that there is some internal unrest within the Trump campaign, just as there has been before, despite that big staff shakeup a couple weeks ago. So, Nicole, you have been inside presidential campaigns, some functional, some somewhat less functional. So what do the last few days, with all this shilly-shallying over immigration and Trump's persona, tell us about what's going on in Trump world?
Well, listen, my biggest sort of window into Trump world is Kellyanne Conway's new role, probably because she serves as a spokesperson for the campaign in addition to its campaign manager, a job that I had. And I mean, watch what she's had to say about immigration since she took control of that campaign. I think we don't have any of it, but she started on a Sunday show with Dana Bash saying that the actual policy was still to be determined, but that she assured viewers that he was softening the edges. Her expertise is taking some of sort of the most polarizing figures on the right and making them more palatable to female voters. So I think she made her case, and it's apparent that he was listening to her. But as with his VP selection process, he sort of deliberated in public. He did that bizarre interview with Anderson Cooper where he said, Anderson, you keep calling it a softening. It's actually a hardening. And, you know, he'd been the one that had introduced the concept of a softening. So to watch him sort of take advice from different members of his inner circle in public, grapple with it in public, and then he came down hardcore on the Breitbart right yesterday with that speech. So you can, it's obvious, you know, who's sort of won and lost. I mean, the people that thought he needed to look presidential won the fight about whether he goes to Mexico or not, and the people that thought he had to look like a badass when it came to rounding everybody up and sending him home won on the speech. And it's just, you know, like I said before, it underscores Hillary Clinton's sort of more fundamental case about how he manages things, and his selling point is he's a rich guy who manages a successful business. He doesn't look like a very good manager.
I saw someone tweeted yesterday, I thought brilliantly, that daytime Donald Trump, for the daytime Donald Trump, Kellyanne Conway's in control. The nighttime Donald Trump, however, is under the control of Steve Bannon. And that certainly was what it looked like yesterday. We also saw reporting in the New York Times and elsewhere about the role, Chris Christie having a role, Rudy Giuliani having a role, Jared Kushner having a role. None of that's news exactly, but at this kind of key moment in the campaign, to have that much chaos, that much conflicting advice, not people on the singing out of the same songbook, it just, I mean, again, there are a lot of campaigns that are chaotic, but this campaign is now on version 4 of chaos, and it's not getting any better.
And I think candidates have to be able to take a lot of information from a lot of different people. The problem is that as we watch him process it, he comes out on both sides of a two-sided debate. All right, so when we come back, we're going to take a spin through some battleground states with Larry Sabato after this quick break. Fox News has a new national poll out that shows the presidential race tightening up a bit. In a two-way contest, Hillary Clinton is beating Donald Trump by 6 points, 48 to 42%, but that's down from her 10-point post-convention lead 1 month ago. In a four-way race, the two candidates are essentially tied. with Hillary Clinton at 41%, Donald Trump at 39%, and Libertarian candidate Gary Johnson getting 9% of the vote. Green Party's Jill Stein coming in at 4%. Larry Sabato is the director of the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia. He's tracking polls and joins us now from UVA to make us smarter and talk about the state of the battleground states. So, Larry, what should we be paying more attention to? These two-way numbers that seem to be everywhere, or what people actually see when they go to vote, the four-way polls?
The two-way is much more indicative of how the race will probably turn out, and the 6 points difference there in the two-way is actually pretty close to the polling average of about 5 points for Hillary Clinton. There's some research indicating that, and I think it's very good research, that the four-way race, just by introducing the names of the third-party candidates, you increase their support, especially in a race like this. Their numbers are going to go down between now and November.
So, Larry, I want to talk to you about some battleground states here. I know you say that Colorado, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Virginia, all likely Democrat, but there are a bunch of other blue states, or traditionally blue states, that are closer than expected. Nevada, Iowa, Ohio, North Carolina, Florida, you got those just as leaning Democrats. So among those states that, like Barack Obama won the last two cycles, where is Hillary Clinton most vulnerable right now?
Well, she's vulnerable in Iowa because almost half of the population of Iowa is white non-college, and that, of course, is Trump's bailiwick. Nevada, she's somewhat vulnerable because they've been through a terrible recession, much longer and deeper than the rest of the country. And we all know that North Carolina is incredibly close. It always is. I tend to think it has a little bit of a blue tint this year. You know, Florida and Ohio, it's obvious to everybody. They're highly competitive, but I still give Clinton the edge. Larry,
what do you attribute the tightening this week to? Because Hillary Clinton's numbers now look a lot like what they look like after the Comey press conference. It seems when she goes through a scandal, there's a tightening. When she gets a couple good weeks behind her, she widens the spread. Do you think this is sort of a pattern we can expect if the contours of the race stay basically the same?
No, I think it's simply the gradual evaporation of the convention bounce. Donald Trump had a very brief convention bounce. It wasn't very impressive because, to be blunt, his convention wasn't very impressive. The Democratic convention was excellent from a number of different perspectives. Hillary Clinton got a big bounce out of it, but just on schedule. The convention bounce has declined as we approach Labor Day, and we're back to a lead that makes sense. Now, remember how polarized we are. I think it's very unlikely that Hillary Clinton is going to do much worse than Barack Obama did in 2012. He won by 4 points, or much better than Barack Obama did in 2008 when everything was going the Democrats' way. He won by 7 points.
So, Larry, let's go back to the map again and look at some of these states that are traditionally red states that people are now talking about the possibility that the Clinton campaign can put in play. They said today that they're going on the air, for example, in Arizona. There's 5 other kind of normally Republican states that could be in play: Georgia, Arizona, and to some extent, maybe Utah, Kansas, Missouri, South Carolina. So which one of those normally red states is the place where Trump might be vulnerable, most vulnerable?
Well, there are only 2, Arizona and Georgia. The other ones are fun to talk about, but in the end, they'll go for Trump. Though I'll tell you, the margins for him as the Republican nominee will be considerably lower than for other Republican nominees, the popular vote, that is. But doesn't matter as long as he gets one more vote than Clinton in those states. But Arizona and Georgia are ripe for the picking, and yet you know, we're so polarized. On my map, I've still kept them light red simply because in the end, I tend to think the partisans will come home. But if I'm wrong, it'll be about Arizona and Georgia.
All right, so finally, let's shift to the state of the Senate races. You say Democrats are now the slight favorite to win back the chamber. Walk us through that path to victory, if you will.
Sure. Of course, the Senate is 54 seats Republican, 46 Democrats. Democrats have to win 4, assuming that Tim Kaine becomes vice president and breaks the tie. There are 2 seats that just about everybody concedes to the Democrats. Republican incumbents in Illinois and Wisconsin are likely to lose. So then the question becomes, where do the other 2 seats come from? The most likely 3rd seat is Indiana, where Senator Evan Bayh is trying to reclaim his old seat. And then I think Pennsylvania and New Hampshire are both leaning to Democrats with Republican incumbents. Democrats only have to worry about Nevada.
I'm happy to hear my friend Rob Portman isn't on your list of people you're worried about. All right, Larry, thank you so much for giving us a look into your crystal ball. When we come back, we'll talk about the man behind Trump's campaign finances right after this.
It's a fairy tale about a wealthy businessman with no political experience who went from making deals in New York to working on a national presidential campaign. No, we are not talking about Donald Trump. We're talking about Donald Trump's national finance chair, Steve Mnuchin, who's the subject of a new Bloomberg Businessweek story. That piece is called Trump's Top Fundraiser Eyes the Deal of a Lifetime. And joining us is one of the reporters behind the story, Bloomberg's Max Abelson. Max, thank you for coming on the show. Tell us about Steve Mnuchin. Who is this guy?
That was the question Zach Miter, my co-writer, and I had. I mean, no one really in this world had quite known about him. In fact, the jobs that he had over his life are things that Trump fans are not crazy about. He was in Skull and Bones at Yale, where we found out he drove a Porsche. He went to work for Goldman Sachs, like his dad, where he became a partner. He ran hedge fund money for George Soros. Then he became a Hollywood guy. He bought a bank. And all through this, by the way, he was giving money to Democrats, including Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. So people were surprised when he got this job.
And his role, as I understand it, is much broader than just dialing for dollars. Talk about his role in Trump's sphere of influence, how often he talks to him, who are his allies, is he close to the family? Tell us more about his orbit.
No, that's right. It's not like Steven Mnuchin is now just raising money for Trump, which would be an important enough job. National
finance director.
Absolutely right. I mean, that's important. But he's on the Economic Advisory Council, where the other members of the council, and by the way, there are like 17 Steves. There are a lot of guys named Steve on the Economic Advisory Council. I think it's like there are like 5 of them. The other guys told us that they see Steven Mnuchin as a guy with Donald Trump's ear. So he has been spending a lot of time doing things that campaign finance guys don't normally do. He traveled with him to Scotland, where Zach Miter, my colleague, points out there aren't a lot of American citizens who are allowed to donate. So clearly, he is, I think it's fair to say, part of the inner circle.
So, Max, what's Steve Mnuchin's game here? He's not been traditionally a big player in politics or even in political money. So what's his end game here? What's he hoping to get out of this gig?
Yeah, I think that's the #1 question that we had. And when we talked to the people who've known him for a really long time, what the theory sort of in New York and LA is that this is a guy who can spot opportunity, and he has seen a trade. And there's definitely a downside. I mean, there are people in sort of Wall Street, even though people think of Wall Street as conservative, they're pretty liberal. There are a lot of people who are a little suspicious about his ties to Trump. But if he has to put up a little bit of tongue clucking for a couple of months, and it's going to be hard work for a few months, the bright side. If Donald Trump wins, if his man gets in, Steve Mnuchin is the kind of guy who could become the Treasury Secretary of the United States. So it would be quite a payoff for him potentially.
And that seems like his thinking, because it's not clear to me just how successful. A finance chair is usually in charge of the bundling process of the big dollars, and it seems to me that Trump's doing a little better with the small donations, the kind of people that come to his rallies and give. So how successful has he been at his actual job on the Trump campaign?
Well, one of the fun things about writing this story with Zach Miter is that what we found is that the operation that Stephen Mnuchin is in charge of, really, instead of looking like Mitt Romney's operation or Hillary Clinton's, these were machines that spent, these guys spent years, or if not in Hillary Clinton's case, decades building up these kind of networks. What Trump has essentially looks like sort of, a classic Donald Trump business. When he has colognes like Success, which I have back at my desk.
Do you seriously?
I seriously do.
Does it smell good? Are you wearing it?
No, I'm not wearing it right now. But when he has these colognes...
I have a cold, I can't smell anything.
Right.
Sure, you smell great.
Thank you. So these colognes, including Success, they're made by other people. These are businesses where Trump licenses his name to other people's operations.
Right, it's a branding guy.
And in a funny way, that's what's happening right now with the fundraising operation. The RNC is doing a lot of the work because, mind you, Donald Trump did not have networks of these people and didn't have these ways of making money, and neither did Stephen Mnuchin.
Max, we don't have a lot of time left, but I just want you to give us a little picture of what's this guy like? I mean, first of all, I can't smell you even from here in Los Angeles, so I'm sure you smell really good. But what's this dude like?
Awesome.
Is he charming? Is he scheming? Is he tough? I mean, just give us a quick personality sketch.
Well, I will say that it was a little intimidating to write about him because he comes across as a little bit bland. He's not a guy who's super into Donald Trump and seems like a political diehard. He seems like kind of a businessman who's sort of on the verge of a business deal, one that he doesn't really want to get into. So for example, we would say to him, Stephen, why are you doing this? And he would say it's a unique opportunity at a very unique time. I think he repeated the word unique 4 times in one paragraph when we were talking to him. But he's very Goldman Sachs. You can tell that he really grew up around Goldman Sachs partners. In fact, Lou Eisenberg, the finance chairman of the RNC, was his dad's partner. Lou Eisenberg knew Stephen Mnuchin when he was 10 years old. He told us that Stephen was a very cute 10-year-old.
Wow.
Right. Well, Max, I imagine you were a really cute 10-year-old too.
That's right.
I can make a couple cheap jokes. I won't do that.
I smelled like Success.
The piece is great. It's in the new Business Week. Max Abelson, thank you for doing the show. Coming up, wall-to-wall coverage of the Trump wall. We will talk immigration bigly after this.
Joining us now to talk more about Donald Trump's immigration speech, we have Frank Sherry, the Executive Director of America's Voice, and John Feehery, a legal analyst at the Center for Immigration Studies, who are both coming to us from Washington, D.C. Also here on set, we're joined by Bloomberg Politics' Sahil Kapoor. Thank you guys all for being here with me. John is in L.A. and will be chiming in for a second, but I want to start hearing from all of you on just a policy level. We'll have plenty of time to get into the politics, but can you both tell me your take on the substance of what he proposed in his policy address last night? We'll start with you, Mr. Feehery.
Yeah, the media has been demanding a lot of detail for the past couple of weeks, and they got it. This was a very long speech with a variety of provisions in it that, if enforced, would actually have an effect of reducing our problem of illegal immigration and open borders. And it's quite different from what we've been sold by politicians of both sides of the debate for the past few years. The idea is that we can only have some sort of massive, comprehensive bill that few people will read, and that enforcement will come later. But Trump flipped the script on that, and his proposal basically is we're going to put all these enforcement measures in place first, we're going to get a hold of our immigration system, and then we'll deal with those who are here after all of that. And I think that does get us closer to an actual fix on the illegal immigration problem.
Okay, and Frank, I'd like you to weigh in here because I know you have a very different view on the actual policy. Yeah. Let me hear from you what you think of the policy proposals themselves.
Sure. I mean, this is one of the most hardline proposals we've ever seen from a nominee in modern political history. I mean, all the steps add up to a mass deportation strategy that would drive millions of undocumented immigrants, most of whom have lived in the country for more than 10 years, out of the country, either through government deportation where they'd be picked up by agents or local police and detained and deported, or they'd be forced out because life is so miserable they couldn't work, they couldn't survive. So this was a real far-right, hardline proposal aimed at driving 11 million people out of the country.
Sahil, do you think we at least now, obviously we're going to get into the politics here in a second with John, but we at least have clarity? Do you think we at least know what's in his mind and where he comes down on immigration once and for all? Do you think that was achieved yesterday?
Yes, I don't think he could have been clearer. I think over the last 10 days or so, he'd been raising a lot of questions and kind of making his policy hazy, making his rhetoric softer. And now we know this is the Donald Trump we knew in the primaries. This is a revert to form. All the things that he campaigned on that worked so well with Republican voters, deportation is on the table for everybody. He's going to prioritize the criminals. Legal status and citizenship are completely off the table. He's going to do an entry-exit tracking system, and he's going to do E-Verify to make it very hard for people who are here to stick around and find jobs. So this is the Donald Trump of the anti-immigration vision that took hold in the Republican primary, and not only with Donald Trump, but with the runner-up, Ted Cruz. So this is something that the party has to deal with, and there are a lot of Republican strategists, as you know better than I do, who are extremely nervous to the point of terrified about what this means for the future of their party. So yes, we have clarity. I think our guests will agree that one candidate now on the Democratic side is running on the most pro-immigration platform we've seen in modern times, and one candidate the most anti-immigration in modern times. This is a very stark choice.
John? So Frank Sherry, let me ask you this question. Last night, at least when he first gave the speech, there was some confusion among some of my colleagues in the media about whether he had in fact moderated at all in terms of substance, because of the fact that he did not call for the immediate mass deportation of 11 million undocumented workers in the United States. Did Trump soften at all from his posture in the nomination fight, or is this just as hard as ever, or maybe even harder?
Yeah, as a matter of policy, he didn't soften at all. I do think he got a few sound bites from Kellyanne Conway about, let's not call it mass deportation. Let's just say we're going to enforce the law aggressively. Let's not call it a deportation force. Let's say we'll triple the number of ICE agents. So I do think that it was an attempt to try to sound a bit more reasonable. But quite frankly, I expected that it would have more rhetorical flourishes. I never expected that he would pivot away from his hardline policy. But I think it ended up being much more of a Steve Bannon speech than a Kellyanne Conway speech.
John, let me ask you the same question. Is it your view that Trump is now, is this a tougher set of proposals than he offered during the nomination fight, or basically about the same, or in some ways, would you see any sign that he's moderated at all?
In many ways, it's a clarification of what he's had on his website for months now, his immigration platform. And what he did make clear last night is that the interests of the American worker are going to come first. Because right now here in Washington, the people driving the debate on immigration are primarily cheap labor lobbyists who want more immigration at all costs. And by the way, I wouldn't call this anti-immigration, as I heard a moment ago. This is anti-illegal immigration. We have a country made up of people who are very generous. We have the most permanent residency of any other country by a long shot. And at the same time, doesn't mean we have to tolerate illegal immigration. On the other hand, I do say, I would agree with you that it is a stark choice because I don't know where Hillary Clinton stands on any of these issues. Does she think the border in its current state is fine? I don't know. Does she think E-Verify should be mandated like Trump has proposed? I don't know. So under her plans, I guess we would have some sort of mass legalization in the first 100 days, and then we would have more illegal immigration. That's not fixing the problem.
But John, can I just add, you mentioned this is... you mentioned this was about illegal, this was not an anti-immigration. You mentioned it was just about illegal immigration. Sure, there are illegal immigration components in there, but this is absolutely about legal immigration, too. The blueprint on Trump's website that you just referred to calls for a big crackdown on H-1B visas. It calls for a pause on issuing green cards. It raises the H-1B standard to the green card standard, which is absolutely a matter of restricting legal immigration, too. So this is an attack on immigration from all angles, not just illegal immigration. I
will agree with you that one of the main points that we've actually been welcoming a greater conversation of is the legal immigration angle. The main thrust in D.C. isn't so much an amnesty. All these comprehensive bills had massive increases in legal immigration. And there was a Gallup poll that just came out last week. Nobody, not liberals, not conservatives, not Hispanics, only 15% of Mexican immigrants born in Mexico want increases in immigration. So I think people are starting to realize that there are a lot of people unemployed at all skill levels, and the idea of just dramatically increasing legal immigration because some lobbyists demand it is just, it's not going to fly.
Frank Sherry, I know you're probably about to come out of your chair right now, so I'm going to give you the last word here, let you respond to John.
Look, I mean, Hillary Clinton is in favor of comprehensive immigration reform. A Gallup poll came out just the other day that said, or a Fox News poll came out and said that 77% of the American people think the 11 million undocumented immigrants should be given a chance to get legal rather than round up as many as we can. Only 19% say let's get rid of the undocumented population. So Donald Trump is speaking to that 19%, but he's not speaking to the broad majority of Americans who say, can't we figure out how to be a nation of immigrants and a nation of laws? Can't we figure out how to have legal channels that work and enforcement that works, so that we can actually make sure that people here assimilate, but at the same time make sure people who come in the future legally? Well, there's broad support for that. Unfortunately, the far right and the Republican Party is the tail wagging the dog right now.
If it were popular, it would have happened under President Bush. If it were popular, the bill would have passed under President Obama. It doesn't, because the American people are saying no.
All right, guest host prerogative here. I'm gonna get the last word on all of you guys, because Fox News has a poll out that says 77% of registered voters are in favor of setting up a system to legalize immigrants who are in the United States legally. Presidents of both parties have tried comprehensive immigration reform. As you said, they have fallen short, but the popular support is behind setting up some system for dealing with the people who are already here. All right, Sahil, I'm sorry. John, Frank, thank you all for being with us. I'm sure this debate will continue for many more days. When we come back, we'll check in with our friends on the campaign trail. And if you're watching us in Washington, D.C., you can now listen to us on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM. We will be right back.
Our next guest tonight is one of our favorites, Washington Post political correspondent Ann Gearan, who covers Hillary Clinton. Ann, it is great to see you. We've been talking a lot about Donald Trump today. It's now time to talk a little bit about Hillary Clinton. So I have noticed, it seemed to me, ever since the events yesterday in Mexico City, that the Clinton campaign seems to be taunting Donald Trump. Have you noticed that? And what's that all about?
Yeah. Well, I think it is not by coincidence. For sure, they're taunting him. They're kind of, trying to poke a little fun, certainly, at what they see as a debacle for him, going to Mexico to begin with, and then having two different messages in the same day. But what I thought was most interesting was John Podesta issuing not one but two quite troll-like taunts yesterday to Trump that used kind of Wall Street negotiator language to say that Trump was a poor negotiator, that he didn't close the deal in the room.
Yeah, I would.
Podesta said he got beat in the room, right? Doesn't that sound like Wolf of Wall Street or something?
Well, I would say that when they called him a choker, which is like one of Trump's most favorite. One of Trump's favorite adjectives. He likes to call people a choker or a choke artist. They called him that. I think they're trying to get in his head a little bit there.
Yeah, get under his skin a little bit. I mean, the Clinton campaign has long seen as their best weapon against Trump himself and his thin skin, or what they see as his thin skin. A lot of people think Hillary Clinton has a thin skin too, but so far in this campaign, the Clinton campaign and she herself have done a better job of getting under his skin than he has getting under hers.
And they had Vice President Biden out today, and he was certainly in his element on the trail. Did they view him as sort of a secret weapon in some of the states where she's surprisingly close to Trump? States like Iowa, Wisconsin this week came out with her really within the margin of error. Do you hear that there are plans to use Biden in places where she could use some shoring up among those kinds of voters that he speaks directly to?
Yeah, I mean, I think Biden is a not-so-secret weapon, really. I mean, his chief utility will be twofold, going straight at Trump and in very strong language. He's more comfortable even than Obama or Clinton sometimes at letting the other side have it, and also talking to white working class traditional Democrats, many of whom have been disaffected and for whom Trump holds some appeal. That so far has been the main way they've tried to use Biden, and I expect they'll continue to do so.
I mean, his story today about sitting around the table and having to break it down that we don't have enough money to buy the new tires we need. I can't think of anybody else on the Democratic bench, or for that matter in the Democratic convention all-star lineup, that could deliver that message with the kind of credibility that Joe Biden can. He seems to be sort of in a league of his own, if you will, as a surrogate who can speak to the kind of voters that Hillary Clinton is the weakest with.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of I'm with you, I'm trying to help rebuild the middle class, give everybody a path into the middle class, and sort of renew the promises of what the middle class meant. That's a foundational argument for Hillary Clinton's campaign, and it's one that she tries to apply her own family experience to. But as you just pointed out, there's a greater sense of authenticity and personal stake, personal experience when you hear it come from Joe Biden.
All right, Ann Gearan, as I said, one of our favorites. Always happy to have you on the show. We'll see you next time, and we will be right back. A little earlier this summer, I had a chance to sit down with Catherine Osmond, the author of Grace Without God, The Search for Meaning, Purpose, and Belonging in a Secular Age, for a wide-ranging discussion about two topics that people typically avoid, religion and politics. I started out by asking Catherine about exactly what compelled her to write this book.
I started this book when my son asked, "What are we?" And I had been raised Presbyterian. My husband had been raised Jewish, but we both left our faith. And I had no answer. So I said, "We're nothing." I immediately regretted saying that. I felt terrible. And I spent the past 3 years...
It's not great for the self-esteem.
Yeah, exactly.
We are nothing.
Exactly. So I spent 3 years going around the country interviewing people about what they're doing to fill the vacuum that's often left when they leave their religious traditions behind.
Right. And so what are they doing?
Oh, they're doing all kinds of things.
Yeah.
So they're seeking community, and they're seeking ritual, and they're seeking ways to get out and do good works in their wider, neighborhoods. And they're basically creating a DIY experience to replace religion because they got tired of the institutions, and the institutions were no longer serving them. So they're taking back into their own control the things that they missed about it.
I think it's one of the most interesting things in our society and in our politics that, like, so much of what we talk about in the public sphere is framed around the assumption that people are godly one way or the other, right? And that there's not really a discussion. The one thing that, and no presidential candidate,
right.
If you think about all the possible taboos, a presidential candidate who came out and said, "I'm sorry, I'm an atheist,"
right.
would essentially be politically dead.
Exactly.
Given that that is true, that continues to be the case, it is the case this is a growing phenomenon, right? We have more people who are without faith than there used to be. Do you have a sense of why that is? Like what's driving the growth in this phenomenon?
Oh, definitely. So for decades, for as long as people study this, religious affiliation, the number of Americans who said they were nothing was 7%. Right. Starting in the 1990s, it started to go up. It's now nearly 25%. Right. One of the primary theories about that is the counterculture of the 60s created a boomerang effect, the moral majority, which hardened into the religious right. And once that happened, politics started coming into religion. And it infected it in such a way that people said, if Christianity is about gay rights and if it's about a woman's right to choose, that's not me. I'm out of here. I'm going to go do something on my own because I can't identify with that anymore.
Right. So you think in some ways that the fact that politics has co-opted religion to some extent, and religion has co-opted politics to some extent, is part of the reason that that there's a drift away from organized religion towards the status of being not affiliated, if not non-believers, at least unaffiliated with organized religion, organized churches.
Exactly, because most of the disaffiliated still believe in God.
Right.
So it's what they're leaving is not God. They're leaving the institution. I met a woman in Oakland, California, and she's in her 60s, and she was raised Catholic and treasured those memories of being in the Catholic Church with her family. And she said once the priest started talking about these issues, these social issues, instead of charity, good works, how we can help others, she felt lost and disillusioned, and she left.
Recently we saw Donald Trump attack Hillary Clinton, say she has no religion, we have no idea anything about her, kind of is making kind of mysterious, and it was like a negative, an attack on her for not having any clear religious affiliation. Of course, she's been a Methodist all her life, and there's no actual mystery about that whatsoever. But what's the unaffiliated when they hear those kind of political attacks in the presidential campaign or other campaigns? Well, how do they react to that?
So the religiously unaffiliated would prefer not to know about Hillary Clinton's religion. That will make them very happy. And they do primarily vote Democratic.
Yes, interestingly, I went back and we talked to our pollster, Ann Selzer, before we sat down for this interview. She pointed out that in our last Bloomberg national poll, 18% of all likely 2016 voters were the nones, so the unaffiliated or no religious affiliation or no religion. And among the nones, 64% in this last poll of ours, 64% were in favor of Clinton or leaned toward her, and 20% were for Trump or leaning towards Trump. Which is interesting because, again, if you take your thesis, it's clear that the place where religion and politics most intersect is on the right rather than on the left, and so it kind of makes sense that would be the case.
Yes, exactly. But I would say that this election is one in which religion is not as relevant. I mean, when you have Donald Trump trying to align with the evangelicals, I think most of us know they're not connecting over matters of faith. They're connecting over the sense of nationalism, other things that they connect act on and agree on. Bernie Sanders, the first major presidential candidate who's not very religious. I mean, the way he describes himself, he sounds like a secular humanist to me.
Right.
And then Hillary Clinton is really the one who's the most religious, and she doesn't wear that on her sleeve. So I think that in this particular election, religion is not as important.
So if you were going to, if you were asked to advise a presidential candidate, either a Democrat or a Republican, how to talk about faith in the context of the phenomenon that you've written about in the book, how would you advise them to talk about it? Would you say don't talk about it at all, or would you advise them to talk about it in a particular way that would allow them to appeal to both people who are affiliated and unaffiliated?
Well, you know, President Obama did something really interesting in his first State of the Union address. He was the first president to welcome non-believers. When he says, you know, we welcome Jews and Catholics and people of faith and people of no faith. And to bring the unaffiliated to the table and to acknowledge their growing presence is really important. And I think people increasingly want to know that they're being heard and respected. And just because they're not in the church or the synagogue or the mosque doesn't mean their vote doesn't matter.
Right. Earlier I asserted something which I believe to be true in our current society, which is that it would be very hard to run for president, or in a lot of cases, not totally, there are certain parts of the country would be okay, but largely speaking, to be unaffiliated or to be actively be an atheist and agnostic would be politically a huge political liability.
Right.
Do you think that will be the case 20 years from now? If you think about the trends that you're observing with the unaffiliated, do you think that that is a taboo that eventually, gradually will start to go away?
It's happening so quickly. The changes, when I started this book, 20% of people were unaffiliated. In just 3 years, that's almost 25%. I mean, it's just happening so fast and these groups are becoming more vocal and they're becoming more accepted, and people, sort of like with the gay community, people are starting to say, oh, hey, I have a friend who's an atheist, and they're not so bad.
Right, they're not so bad. Speaking as one, we're not that bad, the unaffiliated. Right. Catherine, you're great.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
All right, thanks again to Catherine Osmond. Again, the book is called Grace Without God, The Search for Meaning, Purpose, and Belonging in a Secular Age. We will be right back.
Head to BloombergPolitics.com right now for a look at Florida's lonely fight against Zika. Coming up on Bloomberg West, Emily Chang talks with Facebook Live's former product manager about his latest venture. And until tomorrow, sayonara.
Oh, don't say sayonara yet, Nicole.
No? What?
Don't say sayonara
Did I
yet.
screw up?
You got to let me say thank you for guest hosting the show for the last couple days.
Okay.
It was great to have you. Now we
you.
say sayonara.
Sayonara.
I'm Mark Crumpton. You're watching Bloomberg West. Let's begin with a check of your first word news. Residents and businesses along Florida's Gulf Coast are bracing for Hermine, which has been